Yes, I think in the previous sessions we have seen the scale and consequences and also the cause of food and humanitarian crisis, and as well as theory and ethics and approaches, and of course how to predict and understand and also prevent the food crisis. And those presentations were very instrumental and educative. Now we want to go for an application and look into the complexity, as Professor Joachim said, or the specific countries. I think this is a session which actually shows us our successes and also, in some cases, our failures in specific countries, and also best practices that can be learned out of it for our action agenda at the end of this conference. So without further ado, I want to invite our speakers which speak from their heart about their regions and their experiences. So each presenter will be presenting as the guideline is already there in a very short manner, so that we understand how we can discuss about it and also see the causes, food and humanitarian crisis in specific regions and countries. So having said this, let me call for my brother, Were Omamo, the CEO of New Groves International, NGI, Kenya. He'll be talking about our region, my region, Horn of Africa, and also specifically my own country, Ethiopia. So, Dr. Were, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Thanks. While I wait for the presentation to be uploaded, I can just say how much of an honor it is to be here. And I speak about Ethiopia with some trepidation, given that former Prime Minister is here. What I'm going to share draws quite a bit from a former position I held as country director of the World Food Programme in Ethiopia, but then also interactions and analysis I've done since that time. But we were asked to consider a few things: the scale of crises, the causes, consequences, some proven promising innovative actions, and some lessons learned. So on the scale, I focus here on both Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia. And really the thing to focus on are these orange and red parts, which show they capture the scale of the challenge in the region at the moment, the food security challenge. So these orange and red and even purple are the areas that are in crisis and worse situation. You can see this is partly as a result of these consecutive failed rains, but this is a region that has had several issues over time: disease outbreaks, conflict, a number of things. So over 24 million people caught in that situation. There's internal displacement, there's disease outbreaks, and then there's an awful expression of food insecurity where people are adopting negative coping strategies, selling assets, fewer meals, and even worse. So that's a situation region-wide. And this is a situation in Ethiopia, where this is from the latest humanitarian response plan, where over 20 million people require food assistance. Almost 5 million require nutrition support. Those are children and women, and other kinds of support, so health, water, and so on. The cost of that is $4 billion just for Ethiopia. That's the costed plan. 2.2 of that is food, so you can see food accounts for the bulk of that, and then non-food. And when you look at across the region, across the country, you can see that this is concentrated in certain areas, and I'll come to that in a second. But this partly is due to conflict, partly is due to climate issues, and long-standing poverty and vulnerability. So coming to the causes, and from now, I concentrate mainly on Ethiopia, and then at the end, come to some more general or broader conclusions. This is what I used to tell my staff is the most important thing they need to understand about Ethiopia. And that is the cropping seasons and the production seasons across the country. And really the story is that at any given moment in the country, in that huge, vast country, there is some part of the country that is experiencing a rainfall or weather event of some sort. Too much rain, too little rain, flooding, drought, harvests that are being damaged by desert locusts, at least in recent years. So this really defines the bulk of the food insecurity challenge. But that black arrow at the top shows that these things, these climate conditions interact with other phenomena linked to domestic politics and regional politics, often leading to tensions and conflict, where there's displacement across national, international borders and internally, economic disruptions, all of these things interacting with these weather events. But this is the biggest story, the real story, or the most important aspect to understand about the country. And so that humanitarian context is really very, very complicated. So, as I mentioned, there are refugees. Many, I think over 26, 27 refugee camps across the country, with refugees from many countries in the region, so Ethiopia being very, very welcoming of refugees. There's this internal displacement due to weather events, but also these disruptions politically, and massive loss of livelihoods. These economic shocks, which we heard about, even before COVID, and the war in Ukraine, there were inflationary pressures and exchange rate depreciation that were really eroding purchasing power. And then, of course, COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine came along, with like any country, Ethiopia suffered the consequences of that. And then underlying all of that, while there's been extraordinary progress against poverty and reducing the rate of poverty in the country, there's still extreme, large numbers of people who are chronically poor and hungry. So all of these things combine to create quite a complicated situation for humanitarian action and food security in the country. Regarding one and a very important aspect of the Ethiopian context is, first, as I mentioned earlier, the immense size of the country, but also the range of access situations that one comes across. So in the north, there are issues relating to conflict challenges. Similarly, in parts of Oromia and Benishangul Gumuz and Amhara, those border areas there. I don't know if this has a pointer. I don't think so. Anyway, but you can see to the west there. And then to the south, those challenges really have to do with infrastructure for the most part. There are some insecurity-related issues there. That's mainly infrastructure. So again, access issues that complicate the humanitarian situation quite a bit. But those are the causes. And the consequences are captured here in this chart. So this chart shows the number of people requiring humanitarian assistance between 2018 and now. So the main story is that over that period, the number of people requiring support surged. This is now humanitarian food assistance, surged from slightly under 15 million to over 22 million, almost 22.5 million people to 20 at the end of 2022. And there was an accumulation of factors that created this. So there was, in 2018-19, there was an IDP crisis. If you recall, Ethiopia at the time had the most IDPs, internally displaced people, in the world, about 3 million people at its peak in 2019. So that dissipated, but those challenges remained. And then there was a very important, that first of these 5 seasons of drought hit Somali region and also parts of Afar in 2019 and 20. There was a desert locust invasion, COVID-19 broke out, a war in northern Ethiopia broke out, another drought in Somali region, and of course, following the droughts, there's the flooding, and then at the moment, the war with the agreement at the end of last year, the war challenges have reduced, but then there's continued internally displaced people along those internal border areas that I mentioned, and then already there was an influx of refugees from Somalia, but now we know that there's a big number coming in, expected probably from Sudan. Right? So that's the situation so all of these things combined to create a big surge in that green part of the chart there. Now this captures the internally displaced people, the chronically poor who need food assistance, or the drought-affected people. All of these are in that bucket. Meanwhile, we have nutrition support, which needed to continue. This is life-saving nutrition support. You can see that really jumped during the war in Ethiopia and continues now. These are women and children requiring assistance, and there are about, I think, 1 million of those at the moment requiring support. So these are the consequences, or this is an illustration of that very complex humanitarian context as expressed in the number of people requiring assistance. So, what were some of the actions that have been taken and are proven to be useful? And just to come back to really what is at stake? What do we all, at any given moment, what do you need to know? So first of all, where are the hungry, the vulnerable? How many are they? How can they be reached? What's the cause? What's driving their food insecurity? How can these drivers of food insecurity be overcome? Using which instruments, programs, and platforms? How do you know that you've been successful? And how can you prevent? Now, I'd just like to point out that these questions are always there, and any humanitarian country team, humanitarian community has to answer them. And it was very interesting to me to see how much more effectively and how much more smoothly these questions are answered when the climate-related crises, as opposed to when they're conflict-related crises. There are many more issues that cloud these questions when it's a conflict. Now, it turns out that food assistance is a very compact, a very well-established and proven unified response. Now, it's really important to recognize that food assistance is not just that top left-hand corner. Most people, when they think of food assistance, they're thinking handouts of cash. But actually, food assistance as defined by WFP, and I think increasingly by most people, most actors and stakeholders, is this combination of objective-based programs. So what are you trying to achieve? That middle section. So is it to address food and nutrition insecurity, resilience, whatever? And then based on that, a selection of the appropriate instrument as driven by the objective and as determined by the context, and then the requirements for supportive activities. So some vulnerability analysis, needs assessments, supply chain, and so on. So this complex, or this package of programs, implied instruments, and implied platforms is what constitutes food assistance. And this is where the innovations are to be found. And I want to suggest that the key innovations really had to do, or have to do, with new processes, new routines that change when a particular instrument is employed, how it is employed, and where is it employed, aiming to do two things. First, to empower vulnerable communities. We've heard a lot about that. So give vulnerable communities more choices and more agency in their own food security. And then while also strengthening the food system. So this is where the innovations, both in short-term response and also long-term action, takes place. So this captures what I'm trying to suggest. And please just focus on that, the left-hand column. So these are ways in which those instruments that I mentioned before, so these in-kind transfers, vouchers and, in-kind transfers, cash and vouchers, vouchers either cash or physical or digital, cash transfers, food purchases. So these particular instruments, how are they applied, when, and to what end? So we've heard a lot about anticipatory action. So forecast-based cash transfers to communities in drought and flood-prone areas. Very important. At the moment, they really, in this current drought, had a big impact in certain communities in the Somali region, not at the scale that WFP would have liked, but definitely thousands of households benefited from upfront transfers of cash that allowed them to engage in different kinds of resilience-building activities. This was backed by some vulnerability analysis and monitoring, market analysis, and supply chain arrangements. Prepositioning of food stocks. Again, you'd think it's actually quite obvious, but this is something that was a really important innovation. There are certain parts of Somali region that are flood-prone, and when the floods are there, you cannot get food in. And it's actually quite with support of donors, to get money up front and buy food and pre-position it in these conflict-exposed areas, and also in flood-prone areas, and also in refugee camps, where the routes to these refugee camps can be very vulnerable to conflict. So pre-positioning food in those areas. And it has the impact of course, protecting food and nutrition security, but also enhancing resilience and reducing the risks related to conflict on supply chains. So again, some upfront activities that give people more choices. Very, very important set of activities in market-based nutrition activities. So fresh food vouchers, satellite, I won't go into all of them, but you can see these are applications of that basic set of instruments in particular situation. Okay. On lessons learned, I would just consider 6 that came out of the work mainly in northern Ethiopia and have strong implications for research. So first, the fact that conflict turns producers into consumers abruptly, and it moves food production in rural areas to food consumption in urban areas in a big way. That really has got to be, you can consider these as questions, or how does it? You can imagine that's the question behind that. These trust-based relationships are undermined. Black markets are formed, and here, just in September 2021, the price of oil in Mekelle was the same as it was in Addis. If you can imagine that, at the heart of that crisis. How did that happen? There's the conflict empowers security officials. These are the people who are defining what's happening in food systems, unfortunately. And it can be some anonymous person at a checkpoint on a small road in a remote area. These transformation functions, storage, transport, processing, these are disrupted. And then, very importantly, the decision-making within the humanitarian system, actually it creates enormous challenges for the humanitarian. But these are lessons that we learned, and they do imply certain very important, I would say, issues for research and consideration. Thanks, and apologies for going over.